welcoming friends. I'm the immediate past president of Friends of Villa Terrace, and I'm so honored that we are co-hosting this event with Boswell Books. We're so proud, and we're so proud of our virtual events. And we just want to thank our sponsors that made this all possible: Susan Strecker, in honor of Barbara Strecker, and Angela Westmore, who owns the firm Angela Westmore Design and Build. So I will give the floor to Daniel, Daniel Golden. If you don't know him, everyone knows him, but he is of Boswell Books, and he will be introducing our speaker tonight. Welcome, Daniel.
Oh, thank you, Stephanie. So I'm Daniel Golden, proprietor of Boswell Book Company. It is day 4,409 of us being in business. We are so honored to be a co-sponsor of the Villa Terrace Decorative Arts Museum Friends Spring Garden Series. And when Stephanie and I were brainstorming on who might be one of the speakers, I immediately thought of the wonderful gardener, ceramicist, bookseller, Suzanne Staubach. Her latest book is A Garden Miscellany, an illustrated guide to the elements of the garden. She writes pots and gardens in Northeast Connecticut. She had a long career in independent bookselling at the legendary Yukon Co-op, and she now writes and speaks about garden and ceramic history and sells her handmade pottery nationwide. In addition to her new book, she's the author of several previous books, including Guy Wolf, Master Potter in the Garden, and Clay, The History and Evolution of Humankind's Relationship with Earth's Most Primal Element. We are so honored to have you here tonight. Welcome to the Villa Terrace Friends Decorative Arts Museum Spring Garden Series.
Wow. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you, Friends of the Villa Terrace. So I'm going to talk about A Garden Miscellany, which is kind of a new, a different way of looking at gardens. It's about the things that organize a garden, that organize the space. It's the things that make a garden work, that give it its personality. It's the elements of a garden. You could call it garden anatomy. It's not horticultural advice. It's not what plants to put with what plants. It's not how tall plants get or fertilizers. It's all the other things that make a garden. And because it's a miscellany, it's alphabetical. So it's things like alley, arbor, arboretum, arch, aspect, and on to gate, gazebo, geometry, greenhouse, and all the way to water feature, woodland, and yard. You get the idea. And it also includes some different types of gardens like Japanese garden or Italian garden, because today we can include those gardens in our larger landscape. They don't have to be just one, your whole garden doesn't have to be one kind now. We can have different gardens within it. So I've included those as elements, and I've tried to include a few juicy tidbits, shall we say. Looking at these elements is a way to understand your own garden and a way to understand gardens that you're visiting. And it's also a way to help you design a garden or think about a new garden. Though fashions change, it turns out the garden elements repeat throughout history. These elements repeat throughout geography, and they repeat throughout climate. So they keep appearing over and over again. You know that old saying, there's nothing new under the sun. Well, it looks like they were talking about gardens. So let's think for a minute about arbors. You know, I like to sit under a grape arbor, my son's grape arbor, with my granddaughters. And in the summer, you know, it's hot and it's nice and shady and cool and green under there, and the grapes are growing. And, you know, 4,000 years ago in ancient Egypt, people did the same thing. They started their arbors for growing grapes. They ate the grapes, they made raisins, and of course they made wine. And so it was an agricultural crop. But, you know, they quickly realized that it's also a very comfortable place to sit. And Egypt is hot, so it's a very nice place to be cool, catch the breezes. It turned out to be very pretty. They might want to grow something pretty on it too. So here they were, 4,000 years ago doing the same thing that I was doing with my family. And all of us, there's a lot of things like that. They're all doing the same thing. And in fact, in Egypt, the hieroglyph for wine is like a stylized drawing of a grape arbor. So there's two sticks with forks on top and then a piece across. And then there's grapes hanging down and then a basket for picking. In fact, that was on there's two of those on the Rosetta Stone. Then arbors have appeared, everywhere. They've appeared in the Roman gardens. They appeared during the Middle Ages. They appeared in monastic gardens. By the 19th century, they were everywhere in the United Kingdom. They were everywhere in this country, and they're kind of a symbol of middle-class stability and even of wealth. And the interesting thing is, whether you're talking about a arbor in Rome or ancient Egypt or wherever, they kind of do the same thing for each of us, besides holding our grapes or our roses or honeysuckles. They can frame a view. They can lead you through the garden. And so, you see the arbor and you're kind of pulled through to go onto the other side. They can kind of hold different parts of the garden together. Of course, they're a perfect spot for a wedding photo. Photographers love them. And they usually have a path leading up to them. So I thought what we would focus on really was paths. Paths are really one of the most ancient elements of a garden. Actually, animals were making paths before people were, and early people would often use a path that had been worn by animals. In fact, I'm sure in your own gardens, you've probably seen like, a rabbit or something like the path that you've cut. And, so that's always been, so people started using the early animal paths, and then people would make their own by just wearing things down. And then, of course, eventually purposely making paths. There's three types of garden paths. There's the destination path, there's a stroll path, and there's a viewing path. And essentially all paths fit into one of these categories. A destination path is direct. It takes you from one place to another. It can be
I would say up, but I can't talk anymore.
a walkway from your driveway to your front door. It can be a path, to your mailbox. It can be an axis in a grand estate garden and takes you off to a big statue or a big urn. It can be utilitarian or decorative. And a destination path can also be a working path and help you with your weeding or your harvesting. A stroll path, on the other hand, encourages visitors to move at a very leisurely pace around the garden, be chatting, thinking. There's usually curves, there's places to pause, things to see. Ancient Chinese and later Korean and Japanese gardeners featured stroll paths in their gardens. Actually in Japan, at the first half of the 17th century, they became very disturbed about the missionaries coming into their country from Europe and decided to lock them out. And in fact, they decided to seal the country off from the rest of the world. They kept everybody inside and who was Japanese and everybody else outside. So even their nobles were not allowed to travel any place. Everybody had to stay. And this went on for 241 years. So what they did is they really developed their stroll gardens. They'd been inspired by the stroll gardens in China and Korea. And these gardens became their salvation. They gave them pleasure. They gave them the illusion of a journey. If you were strolling through the garden, you felt like you were on a trip. They made bridges and artificially contrived scenes. And they had like special views and flowers. And sometimes they had a special place where guests could stop and write a poem and drop it in the pool, or they could, sit on a wall along the ways and have a glass of wine. this was their salvation. This really, made it possible to be locked in their country for almost 2.5 centuries. Then in the mid-18th century, Commodore Perry opened Japan, and he ended their isolation because, of course, other countries wanted for a market. An unexpected result of that, though, was that now the West was exposed to these beautiful stole gardens, and also to all the plants that were growing in Japan. And in fact, it was less than 10 years and they were being sold in Long Island. A very different kind of stole garden was in Versailles, built by Louis XIV in France. It was crisscrossed with axes, long, straight paths. He made his garden because he wanted to show off. He wanted the biggest, best of everything. He wanted the biggest, best garden. But he also wanted to keep an eye on his nobles. He didn't want any competition. And so he had his axes, or the paths that they would stroll on, as a place for the nobles to, promenade and show off their fancy clothes and be seen, and to see others, and of course for him to watch. Viewing paths are constructed so visitors look down upon the garden beds. The great gardens of Islam are known for their viewing paths. They were made with straight lines. The beds were sometimes sunken, so the visitor could walk on the path and look down on the patterns of the flowers, or enjoy the tops of a tree and blossom at the height of their nose. The famous Chaharbagh, the 4 square gardens of Islam, consist of 4 beds and a path that crosses in the center, and then a path around the perimeter. Sometimes these were water courses, but often paths. And this same classic 4 square garden was then adopted in Europe, much of the monastery gardens, in formal Italian gardens, and early American gardens also adopted the 4 square. And it's popular today in formal estate gardens and in country herb gardens. And these paths can also be used for, actually working in the garden. I have I have a very, I call it a cottage gardens. It's, it's overgrown, it's messy, it's lousy. But I have a informal 4 square garden in the front, and then the rest of my paths are curved and windy. My borders are curved. But the front with the 4 squares, it's much more tranquil than the other part that's more informal, and because that underlying geometry gives us a sense of calmness and tranquility, because we know what to expect. Except in the Far East, in China and Korea and Japan, all garden paths were straight lines. So every place else was straight lines except for the Far East. And then, then the curves began to be introduced elsewhere. And today we have both curved and straight gardens in our paths. We can mix them up. We can mix up the uses for the garden. So the same path can be for strolling, or for viewing, or for getting from here to there. That's the great thing about thinking about all these elements, is because, again, we can pull all these things and ideas and lessons from thousands of years of garden history and thousands of miles of geography. Of course, some gardens don't have paths at all, and that's okay too. But a lot of people think of the path as, it's the narrative of the garden. It's the itinerary. It tells the story. It's just, one of the things that's interesting about an interesting element to me, and I hope to you. And one of the things that when I was working on this book, and I was thinking about remembering working on this book, is, well, first of all, I used I have too many garden books in my house. I know you can't have too many, but my house actually makes noises from the weight because they're all stacked up here and there. So of course I relied on a lot of books, and And I bought more books, and especially there's a lot of interesting authors from the early 20th century, a lot of women gardeners who were writing and publishing then, and used them. But of course, like everyone today, I had to use the internet too, and discovered that, not really discovered, but of course, there's like false information too. And I came across 3 different citations saying that this family named the Pullums in England had invented bird baths, which of course, we know that's not true, because if you look at frescoes in Pompeii, there's bird baths. So, so that was just a little lesson, but mostly, besides the books, like anyone, I wanted to visit gardens, and no, my publisher would not send me on a world tour to visit everything, but I visited some things locally. And one of the things that I visited was a labyrinth. I had never been to a labyrinth before. And I visited a labyrinth in Woodstock, Connecticut, and walked the paths. And a labyrinth is unicursal. There's only one path, and this way in and the way out are the same opening. Many people confuse labyrinths and mazes, but they are different. A maze is multicursal. It can have several openings. It can have blind ends. So you're going down the path and you end up, you can't go any further because there's a block. It's a puzzle. The classic labyrinth is 7 courses. And of course we have, even besides paths and gardens, labyrinths were drawn in, on clay and on floors and things. It can be enlarged and still keep the classic design if you enlarge it in 4 courses at a time. The early labyrinths were made of stone, sometimes raised turf or shells. And there's still, many of these can still be found. There's more than 500 ancient labyrinths in Scandinavia. There's quite a few, and those are all stone. There's quite a few in England and Germany. There's some turf ones. Today, labyrinths are popular in hospitals, churches, and school gardens for meditating and grieving. The one that I visited was made of gravel and stone. And, just first looking at it, it's like, that's it. There's nothing really grand about it. But walking it, slowed me right down and, focuses your mind. And today, to make one, you can actually buy landscape fabric that's printed with a labyrinth. And all you have to do is place your stones and put your mulch or whatever, or gravel, whatever you're going to put down. And there you have a labyrinth in your backyard. We're not sure when the first hedge labyrinths were made. And of course, those are the ones that we all think of with the big, tall hedges, and they appear in a lot of movies and books. But by the Renaissance, they were really high prestige, and they were often, royalty wanted them. They, were very labor intensive, very expensive. They were meant to walk through, and they were also meant to look down upon from the windows. And they took a long time to make, because it takes a long time to grow a big hedge like that. They quickly evolved into mazes, and the mazes became even more elaborate, and people would add all kinds of things like a grotto or, a tunnel. There would be all kinds of dead ends, and they'd be very difficult, it would be a way of entertaining their guests, and very difficult to get out of. It would take you a long time to get through a maze. And today, these are, the ones that have lasted are great tourist destinations and much, much imitated. Today, people who are not royalty and who can't afford these enormous hedges and stuff, what's become popular today, especially, beginning in the 80s, are corn mazes and sunflower mazes. And a lot of farms are making those for agribusiness, and a lot of house museums have them. Corn and sunflowers grow over 8 feet tall. You can't see down the path beyond, beyond a few feet. So it's good to, it keeps the mystery. They can be as simple as an entertainment for children, or they can be as complicated that you have to be given a cell phone number in case you really can't find your way out and someone has to come and rescue you. And it does happen. And what's very popular too is these nighttime tours. So you go in with your flashlight, especially around Halloween, and try to find your way out. To make a maze, it takes quite a bit of land, even using corn or sunflowers, and they're usually like 3 acres to as vast as 30 acres. But a labyrinth, we can make a labyrinth in our backyard if we want. They don't take up that much room. I mean, you can make a huge one, or you can do the hedge one, but they don't take up that much room. What I thought I would do now is just read you a little bit about fairy houses, just so you know I'm not a snob, and read you the fairy house chapter. The book has all kinds of no, it's not a book of photographs. It has all kinds of, here's the arbor, all kinds of, pretty pictures. I'll read about the fairy gardens. Gardeners have been infatuated with miniatures for thousands of years. In China, Taoists created miniature mystical landscapes as early as the 1st century. By the Tang dynasty, the art of penjing, creating miniatures, landscapes in ceramic or bronze dishes, was in full flower. These sophisticated groupings featured tiny trees, mountains, and lakes. Japanese travelers brought some of the dishes home, where, influenced by Zen simplicity, the gardens evolved into a single heavily pruned and trained tree in a shallow ceramic dish, a style that would come to be known as bonsai. Victorians used inherently diminutive alpine plants in their rock gardens to create miniature landscapes, sometimes scale models of actual landscapes. In the late 19th century, Lady Broughton created miniature mountains and valleys in imitation of the mountains of Savoy and the Valley of Chamonix at her manor in England. Victorians also enjoyed creating miniature worlds in terrariums, which they enhanced with moss, pebbles, and sticks. Meanwhile, fairies, elves, wood sprites, and wee folk occurred in pre-industrial European folklore and superstition for centuries, perhaps millennia. Parents believed that fairies could steal a baby and take the infant's place, becoming a changeling. A fearful thought that explained children with birth defects or problematic behavior. It was the fairies' fault. Naturally occurring fairy rings and circles of mushrooms were evidence of reveling elves or dancing fairies. Unexpected mishaps, and worse, were blamed on fairies. In order to avoid their tricks and pranks, Europeans at the time believed it was provident to create welcoming spaces with soft leaves and beds and other niceties. So they were, trying to appease the fairies, make them happy. In the 1950s, Anne Ashbury promoted miniature gardens as a solution for elderly, handicapped, and landless gardeners. Her book, Miniature Gardens, also intrigued gardeners who suffered from none of these inconveniences. And interest in miniature gardening spread in the United States and in the UK. So there's something about tiny things, about miniatures, that just kind of gets to all of us. All of these historical threads are found in today's fairy gardens. A fairy garden might be as simple as a small Gothic arched wooden door affixed to the base of a gnarled tree trunk. It might have a path of pea-sized flat stones leading up to the door, or perhaps a circle of ferns and violets. It can be made of little houses constructed of sheets of bark and moss with acorn bowls and tables and chairs made of twigs, all tucked into a corner of a larger garden or nestled in a planter. Plants might include soft lamb's ears for beds, foxgloves for fairy bonnets, and hollyhocks for fairy skirts. Remember doing that when we were all kids. Garden centers and online specialty shops offer fairy houses, arbors, wells, picket fences, swings, bridges, elements of the garden, and other accessories for creating a fairy garden, even little fairies themselves with gossamer wings. Yet everything in a fairy garden need not be miniature. In our collective imaginations, fairies are tiny, but they inhabit our world. So they can be, we can have the little tiny fairies and little tiny beds for them, but the rest of the garden is full size, is larger. And today, besides all the popularity of creating fairy gardens and within people's own gardens or in terrariums, there are a lot of fairy events. I know the Florence Griswold Museum in Old Lyme has a big fairy house festival, and they invite like 38 or 40 artists each year to make a fairy house, and then people go and look at all the fairy houses, and maybe they see fairies, I don't know. So I just thought I would share that with you. And then I'll share one more thing with you, and then maybe we can do some conversation or chatting, but this is a little more prosaic. Compost bins. And I'll just do a little bit of this. The first written account of people mixing decaying organic matter for fertilizer appears on clay tablets from King Sargon's reign during the Akkadian Empire in present-day Iraq. That was around 2300 BCE. It describes manure compost. There was also evidence of early composting in China that was made of cooked bones, manure, and silkworm debris. India and some experts contend in situ composting as much as 12,000 years ago in Scotland. Ancient peoples likely noticed that the plants that sprang up where there was rotting plant matter and livestock waste was particularly robust. Cleopatra was so taken with the work that worms do in making compost that she protected them, decreeing that any Egyptian who took worms out of the country would be put to death. I thought that was one of the, it's sort of one of the juicy tidbits. I couldn't believe it. That's how she realized how important they were and how important the work is. In his old age, the Roman farmer and author Marcus Porcius Cato, or Cato the Elder, wrote a reflective treatise on farming in which he shared his agricultural advice. He counseled his fellow agrarians to make a big compost heap or manure or litter lupine straw and beanstalks. Many writers also ended up talking about compost. Shakespeare, Sir Francis Bacon, Sir Walter Raleigh, all talked about compost, believe it or not. Hamlet warns against adding compost to weeds to make them ranker. George Washington determined to discover how best to improve his soil. Tested compost made of different ingredients. He had a stericori, or dung repository, built near his stables at Mount Vernon, a precursor to and rather glorified version of our compost bins. Beneath was a pit lined with cobblestones. And then above he had like a big post and beam structure so that pigeons and other birds could just come sit, and lo and behold, there would be the compost below in the pit that he would catch. And now if you go to Mount Vernon, they've reconstructed one of these so that you can see it. The art of composting was largely forgotten during the West love affair with chemicals and pesticides. This changed when Jerome Rodale, founder of Rodale Press, read an agriculture treatment by Sir Howard, who was working in India. And he became so entranced with the idea that he became like a zealot and a missionary for compost. And he started his magazine and he gave it away for free, and he made compost himself. And actually he did change people's minds, and people did start composting. So of course, that's another element in our garden is the compost bin, be it humble or fancy. It could be fancy like Washington's, or humble like ours, made out of old pallets wired together, or a fancy one that you buy. So it's a book I had fun writing, and I hope and think it might be fun, fun to read. Just all these different aspects, all these different elements that we have in our own garden that maybe we didn't think about as much before, that have been with us for so long, all these elements that people have been utilizing in their gardens for thousands of years all over the world. And we can just, take advantage of them all and incorporate them into our gardens, or even just like knowing their history or how they were used kind of enhances our own experience of our own garden or gardens that we visit. So I would be happy to have a conversation or take questions, because I like questions. I like visiting with others who are gardeners. So. maybe I don't know how that works.
Stephanie, did you have a question? You're muted.
Yes, I was going to ask, how did you know Cleopatra was into compost? Like, how do you find records like that?
Again, I said that was actually I found it in the books. There's a lot of there's a lot of history of gardening books. There's one of my favorite gardening books is by a guy named Huxley, and he's very fascinated with that kind of thing too. And I think it was in his book that I found that reference. But the Egyptians wrote down what they did. I mean, they wrote about, they kept their own records, and they also depicted a lot of things in their hieroglyphs. In fact, there are a lot of pictures of Egyptian flower pots, and remarkably, they look like our flower pots because they knew the top is wider and then it goes down, so you can take the pot out and repot it. It doesn't get stuck because it goes in and you have to break the pot. And we know that because they drew pictures of it and we see it. So they wrote about things, they drew pictures of things, and then some of their gardening knowledge too was then written about by some of the Roman gardeners, would incorporate that in their own advice. So, good question.
What do you grow in your garden, and what do you use for compost?
I grow more flowers than vegetables. I used to grow more vegetables, but I grow more flowers because I like them and because two of my sons have farms and I eat their tomatoes instead of growing mine. We make compost ourselves. We save all our scraps. So we have a couple of compost bins. And then our town, I'm in a rural area of Connecticut, and our town has compost from leaves that people bring and stuff like that. So if I run out, I can go get that, although it's not as good as what we make ourselves, because I'm never quite sure what all they, it has to be sifted what all they put in it. So are you a composter?
No, I just know that it's important, for the earth, and I'm always trying to find the right kind. So I just thought maybe if you purchased it, what kind, because there are different grades of compost.
It's really easy to make though. You don't have to have a fancy thing. You can just have a heap. In a couple of years, there you are.
I'm beyond heaps. But thank you. So you're in Connecticut. Are you in Connecticut now? Is that what you're? Oh, okay. I didn't realize that. Okay. All right.
Tell us about yourself.
What do you want to know?
Well, I took a peek at your webpage, but it looks like you've had a long and interesting career. And tell us about that and how you wandered through the garden story and the pottery story and all of that.
No, I was a bookseller for a long time, for decades actually. And, I love that, but I love that. I love books. I'm a bookaholic. It's I'm a book addict. So, but I've played with mud since I was in my 20s. I've been a potter, for a long time. And, gardening and pottery go together. Many potters over the years have been gardeners, and many gardeners have been potters. And it often was a seasonal thing. So in the winter, when you couldn't be out in your field, you would be throwing pots. And then in the summer, you could fire the pots and be working in your fields. So it's one of those things that's been kind of like symbiotic in many, many parts of the world. So, that was not how it was for me. I was not working out in the fields, trust me, but they just kind of like go together. And this, you got your hands in dirt, really. So,
Do you have some pictures of your pots or your fields?
There's pictures of my garden and my pots on my website, which is willowtreepottery.us. And yeah, there are pictures of both in there.
Maybe you could put that in the chat, Susie, so that we could look it up.
Okay.
Well, I have a question. Which came first, the pottery or the garden?
I don't know. Gardening, I wasn't a gardener, but I had family members who were gardeners. My grandfather was, a carpenter and a vegetable gardener. He swore flowers were a waste of time, although he always somehow mysteriously had like flowers that appeared in his garden, and he would pick a bouquet for my grandmother. And she grew, iris and dogwood and things. And so I paid attention to her garden. And my mother was a vegetable gardener. So I was always like around gardens. And then, I guess I just thought that's what we're supposed to do, but then I got addicted, and then I discovered English gardens and started going to the library reading about English gardens. And, it gets dangerous. One thing leads to another. So, yeah.
What do you think of Capability Brown?
I think, well, certainly incredibly influential, influenced our park movement, and influenced things like, the fact that we have like Central Park and parks and cities. All that is influenced, our college campuses, all that's influenced by Capability Brown and his idea of a landscape. That said, he did some terrible things. To make the view beautiful and sweeping, and of course his clients were all rich. He knocked down whole villages. He moved, people who had like their own their vegetable plot, their cottage garden around their house. It was an eyesore to him. He got that, he destroyed them. Sometimes they were relocated, but sometimes they weren't. He also did not, he got rid of like a lot of Italian gardens that people had. He ripped up their terraces, and he had the landscape come right up to the front door. And of course, it wasn't really as open and free as he was pretending it was, because he had the ha-has, which are also interesting. So it would look like there was no barrier, but there was, because there was a trench. But that's, so that the only way it was in a way, they were like gigantic stroll gardens. They're meant for like touring through. He also moved the walled kitchen gardens away from the house and away from the kitchen. So you had to go, distance away. That said, but then he had the idea of like a pretty, a temple to look at, or, beautiful mountains and all that kind of thing. I think after him, Henry Repton kind of humanized the idea. He's the one that said, what, we can have a stone terrace, and we can have a place to put a table and chairs. It doesn't have to all be landscape. And then beyond that can be the pastures and things. And I think he's actually been more of an influence on all the, what we have today for landscapes, and certainly, later the arts and crafts movement. So, I respect his revolutionary thinking and some of the things he did, but so I think he did some bad things. What do you think?
I guess I just know a little bit that he made designs that didn't look like they were designs, and I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that's true. He wanted to look natural. He made ponds, he moved trees, he built hills, then he would put a temple. So yeah, you felt like it was all there. And then the temple was supposed to like suggest to you, like, Roman author and stuff. Yeah, they were, and some of them you can still go see. And he did influence our park movement and stuff. But
I wonder if everybody knows what a ha-ha is. You might want to explain that.
I was just going to add that.
Beat you to it, Nicole.
I have a fence that would interrupt your view. It was a trench. And so if you looked at it, it looked like the land went on forever. But if the animals, say, the sheep were grazing on one side of the ha-ha, they could not come up on the other side of the house and start like nibbling like close to the door or anything, because there was a big trench that they couldn't get across. Often the trench, one wall of it would be bricked. There are there are some artists who use ha-has today in their work. The problem today is that, just like the sheep can fall in and knock it out, so can people. So, in a lot of places they're like, you can't make one because someone could get hurt. But they're a pretty interesting idea, and it's kind of nice not to see fences, I guess. Yeah.
Didn't they sometimes have bushes too that were next to them that would kind of enclose the area or the sheep along
Sometimes,
with the ditch?
and to kind of disguise it. I mean, they didn't want, you weren't supposed to see it. It was the first invisible fence. They were invisible.
Mhm.
So.
Thank you.
You mentioned you liked a lot of the early 20th century female garden writers. Are there any that you'd recommend?
There's certainly there's a woman named Tabor. I'm trying to think of her first name. I think I probably have her in here. What I liked about a lot of them is they're they're very opinionated, and I think that's kind of let's see what her first name was. Grace Tabor. She wrote a lot of books. She was also very opinionated, but she like her books would be like $2, and they're paper like we don't have today, and they're stitched with real binding and stuff, like like 1910 or so. But she was interesting. And certainly what's her name, Louise Beebe Wilder, you probably know her. I mean, I think her books are all still in print. That's very opinionated about color in gardens, and very interested in English gardens, and interested in what the English garden writers had to say, but it's like, it doesn't work for our climate, and so this is what you should do here. And just kind of taking that kind of thing into account.
Okay, thank you.
I have to say the garden magazines of that time period too, the great country house era in this country, the garden magazines, weren't pretty like ours are with all the photographs. Oh, they had such nice, they had like long text. They had real essays, you can actually read them. But ours, it's, 4 paragraphs and then 8 pictures, and that's it.
Thank you so much for being here tonight. I used to find ferns very ordinary and very common, but I've become enamored with them. Stephanie and I just love them. And I noticed that in your book, you had a little bit on fernery. Is there something that you didn't put in the book that you could share with us about ferns?
Probably, but I have to think of what I didn't put in the book. I don't know. I mean, I do think it was interesting that people were, there was fern mania. People were like insane for ferns. And yeah, I think I put most of it in the book. So, do you grow ferns? I think everyone kind of.
Well, Stephanie gives me ferns and I usually kill them.
Oh no.
But I have one alive right now, so I'm very happy.
I mean, they like, do you have forest or woods in your, I mean, like, they like old rotting trunks and things. People can grow in their stumperies and.
Why don't you tell us your favorite ferns and where they grow?
Me?
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a lot of ferns. I have, my place is in an old hayfield. It was, when we came here, the hay had largely reverted back to goldenrod, but it's, it's a big, huge, sunny space. And then well, I won't give you all the craziness of what I did with the hayfield trying to reclaim it, but now, I've kind of enclosed the, around the house with informal hedges and, some outbuildings and things like that. And then I've kept much of the hayfield as a hayfield, so it gives it kind of a, country English feel. And then I've planted many, many daffodils in the hayfield. I mean, they've just finished like blooming. There's thousands. So I don't really have like a nice woodsy, damp, shadowy area where I can be growing ferns. It would be nice if I did. But I got a lot of sun.
We've discovered these Australian ferns called Kimberley ferns or Australian ferns, and they like this one. They're kind of cactusy, and so they're hard. They're more hardy.
Okay, and what are they called?
Kimberley.
Kimberly.
Kimberley or Australian, and they're kind of a cactusy fern.
Okay, yeah, well, that might work. So, because otherwise they just, kind of burns for us.
So then what do you plant in your hot garden?
My gardens, I have a lot of perennials. I do grow annuals too. I think I grow more annuals now than I used to. I have a lot of catnip. I have a lot of baptisia. I have a lot of well, for annuals, I grow cosmos and cleome. I do have a little patch of zinnia. We grow a lot of bee balm for, we try to attract hummingbirds because my partner takes a lot of bird pictures. And he doesn't believe in taking bird pictures at a bird feeder because that's cheating. So we have to have the flowers. A lot of shrubs, viburnum and hydrangea. I love hydrangea. But again, some of those I can't grow either because it's not shady enough. But lime lights, I have the lime lights. Those are nice.
So then, do you have help with your garden?
I just started getting help. I have someone who cuts the lawn, but otherwise, no. Otherwise, it's me. But I like it. So, yeah.
Understand that.
It's not fancy.
Doesn't have to be.
I write fancier than I actually garden.
I had a question about stumperies. You mentioned that, and we saw one recently at the St. Louis Botanic Gardens. Never seen one up here. And what's the origin of a stumpery?
Stumperies they've actually been around. They've been around for a while. I think this guy named Edward William Cook, I think in the mid 19th century, made the first one that, the first named known one that we know of. I mean, people probably casually did it before that because stumps are stumps. What do you do with them? And stuff grows. And he got these enormous like oak stumps and stuff. And so he made like a big impressive one. And then other people saw it and was like, well, that's cool. And started wanting to do it. Prince Charles in England has made a pretty famous stumpery that people go to visit. But yeah, it's an interesting thing to do.
I'm afraid I have no idea what a stumpery is.
Stumpery, well, it'd be good for your ferns, but a stumpery is like you take a bunch of, you can take as few as 3 stumps, but you can take like hundreds of stumps and you place them so that they're like interesting and like the roots are sticking up here and there. And then, you let them decay and you put some compost and stuff around, then you can grow stuff in it. And it's just like interesting. It's just interesting. And
I see.
And it attracts, wildlife, and then it gradually decays and you can bring more stumps in. So you can.
So these are then stumps that you've hauled out, root base and all, from trees you've cut down.
Yeah, you can, but sometimes you can get stumps from contractors because they don't know what to do with them. They're going to throw them away or grind them up. It's like, well, bring that to me. I'll take it.
Okay. That's new to me. Okay. Sounds cool.
I have to say hi to Sarit. Sarit was a bookseller with me a long time ago, so hi, Sarit. So,
Hi, Susie. It's so wonderful to see you.
good to see you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for inviting us. Yay. We're very novice gardeners over here, but we did some planting, trying to grow some of our own herbs to cook with.
That sounds good. Herbs are fun. Herbs are good.
What's your favorite herb to grow and to cook with?
My favorite herb is basil. I cannot put basil in enough things. I think I would put in cake if I could get away with it. Any other questions? All right.
As I mentioned, the book would be a fabulous Mother's Day gift. Thanks again to Daniel of Boswell Books for co-hosting the event. And also thank you so much to our sponsors, Angela Westmore and Susan Strecker. Does anyone else have any more questions? Well, thank you so much for all joining and supporting our Friends of Villa Terrace Spring Garden Series. It's our first virtual event, and we're so proud that we were able to do this, and thank you for your support. So appreciated.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank
night,
you.
everyone.
Thank you,
Good night.
Susie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. So proud of you.
Thanks, Sarit.
All right. I will close the session and everyone have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Nicole.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Right.